Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for this discussion of empowering workers to fight COVID-19. This event is part of our series on democracy and justice in the pandemic. Many events in this series are about democratizing government, but today's discussion is about economic and workplace democracy. Look out for further events in this series, and in particular, a couple weeks from now, we'll be having another event on the idea of creating a 1 million person jobs program to preserve public health and fight unemployment in the United States with Alan Casey, Amy Kopczynski, and Greg Gonsalves. But look for that on the website. Today's discussion is about the central problem that there is a democratic mismatch in this pandemic. Here's the mismatch. Many of the people most affected by the decisions of businesses and other organizations and governments have the least voice and influence over those decisions. The people who suffer the most from lack of health care, paid sick leave, protective equipment, permission to physically distance at work are very often different from the set of people who get to make those decisions. Our guests today have offered ambitious proposals for addressing this democratic mismatch at work. Julie Battilana is the Alan Gleitzman Professor of Social Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School and the founder and faculty chair of the Social Innovation and Change Initiative. Isabelle Ferreras is a tenured fellow of the Belgian National Science Foundation in Brussels, a professor of sociology at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and a senior research associate of the Labor and Work-Life Program here at Harvard University. Julie, Isabelle, and several of their colleagues have written a remarkable manifesto for workplace democracy that was published last week in 36 different publications in over 25 countries, including the Boston Globe, the UK Guardian, Le Monde in France, and Die Zeit in Germany. It has been signed by over 5,000 scholars around the world. We were speculating about whether or not this is the public letter in all of history that has gained the most academic support. It may well be. If you haven't read it, you should, and we'll put some links in the show notes for this event so you can track down that letter. Sharon Block is the executive director of the Labor and Work-Life Program at Harvard Law School. Prior to coming to Harvard, she held many senior labor policy positions in the legislative and executive branches of the US federal government, including heading the policy office at the US Department of Labor under President Obama. Ben Sachs is the Ketzenbaum Professor of Labor and Industry at Harvard Law School, and he is a leading expert in the field of labor law and labor relations, indeed the leading expert at the Harvard Law School. Before coming to Harvard, he served as Assistant General Counsel of the Service Employees International Union, the SEIU, and was an attorney at Make the Road by Walking, which is a community organization in Brooklyn, New York. Sharon and Ben lead the Clean Slate Initiative for Rethinking Labor Policy, and recently they wrote an important issue brief on the importance of economic and workplace democracy together with the Roosevelt Institute. We'll get into the details of their proposal in a moment, but you should check it out on the web. Again, we'll have a link to the brief in the show notes for this event on our webpage. So the usual format here is that we will ask several questions of the panelists here of Isabelle, Julie, Ben, and Sharon, and then we'll open it up to the audience to ask for discussions. And please type in your thoughts and comments and questions all along as we go, and we'll kind of gather those up in real time and collect and bin them as best as we can for the open Q&A period. Okay, so this first question is for Julie. In the manifesto, Julie, that you and Isabelle and many colleagues drafted, you write that, quote, human health and the care of the most vulnerable cannot be governed by market forces alone, close quote, and that involving employees in workplace decisions, democratizing firms, as you put it, would help us to meet the challenges of this pandemic and other enormous challenges like the climate crisis. A lot of people, most people perhaps, look to the forces of the market or competent government to deal with COVID-19. Why do you think that workplace democracy and worker democracy is so important for dealing with this pandemic? Julie, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Archon. Thank you for organizing this panel. Thank you to you and your team. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. So let me tackle this question. So as the United States, and in fact, many other countries are now entering the reopening phase of their economies, the question that I believe we are all facing is what kind of societal model do we want for tomorrow? And it seems to me that staying the course would be the recipe for disaster. Why so? Because the level of social and economic inequality has become untenable. And the pandemic is unfortunately reinforcing the inequalities, and it's certainly making these inequalities more visible, and more so in some countries than in others. One of the very few positive aspects of this pandemic is that it has enabled us to see that we can preserve the environment and preserve the planet, but the reality is that we are reopening the economies. Fortunately, we are doing that slowly but surely, and we have to be careful as we do it. And what we are going to discover is that obviously the environmental crisis is still here. So why am I saying all that? Because it means that we're facing a multidimensional crisis. It's not only a health crisis, right? It's a social, economic, political, and environmental crisis. And I believe that this is the kind of crisis that one single actor cannot solve alone. So the solutions cannot come from government alone, nor from the private sector alone. What is at stake is building a fairer, a more just, a greener society, and that's going to require collaboration across sectors and collaboration across countries. And this is why, in fact, we launched this initiative together with Isabelle Ferreras, who's here with us today, and Dominique Médin. And our objective was to mobilize the academic community and build bridges between research and practice in the spirit of helping as we think about redesigning the model. So now, why do we think, which was at the core of your question, that worker democracy is important in the context of this multidimensional crisis? So let me go back to the roots of our initiative. When Isabelle, Dominique, and myself joined forces to write the text that became the manifesto that you were referring to, we asked ourselves a simple question: what can we learn from this crisis? And our answer is a clear one. What we believe is that this crisis is first and foremost, in fact, teaching us that humans never were resources and are not just resources, right? They invest their life, their time, their sweat to serve the organization that they work for. And as we say in the text, they are just not one of the stakeholders among many. They are the core constituency of firms. And yet, as you mentioned, there is this mismatch, right? That they are so critical. You could say that all workers are essential from that standpoint, if we think about their key role in corporations. And yet they remain excluded from participating in the government of their workplaces. That's a right that's still very much monopolized by capital investors. And so this exclusion is, we believe, problematic from a moral standpoint, right? Because it's unfair. But I think it's also problematic because it prevents corporations from reaping the benefits of workforce democracy at a critical point in time when we need to operate a transition from the old form of capitalism that was really focused on maximizing value for shareholders to a new form of capitalism that's going to have to be about not only financial, but also social and environmental performance. So let me very briefly talk about those two aspects, right? The moral reasoning, as well as the importance of reaping the benefits of workforce democracy. So without workers, there would be no manufacturing plant, no deliveries, no production. As I said, they are essential. And from that standpoint, we argue that they deserve a say in the government of their workplaces. And what it means is that power then must be redistributed and shared more equitably between managers, employees, and shareholders by allowing employees to be represented in decision-making bodies and enabling them to participate in their organization's strategic decision. But beyond this sort of moral argument that's based on justice and the right for employees to participate to these critical decisions, I'd like to emphasize one last point, which relates to the research I've been doing. What I've seen in my work is that workplace democracy may well be critical to the success of corporations in the future. Why do I say so? Because I've been studying organizations that pursue social, environmental, and financial objectives all at once, social enterprises. And what I've found in my work is that organizations that are more democratic, that give a voice to their workers, these organizations fare better. They are better at staying the course. They are better at pursuing these multiple social, environmental, and financial objectives, right? So this is one of the reasons why democratizing workplaces should be an important part of the post-pandemic order. At least I believe so, and I look forward to debating it with you and with all the participants. And so we've done research that proves that this is not only a viable path, but it may well be a necessary one to restructure corporations and businesses in the future. But corporations will not be able to do this alone. They will not operate this change by magic by themselves. Governments have a key role to play in designing policies that will really help support these democratically run organizations and companies that are going to commit to social, environmental, and financial objectives instead of focusing only on the financial ones. So again, to me, it's sort of the moral reasoning and the importance of this shift we have to operate and the key role of workplace democracy in enabling this shift.
Thank you very much, Julie. Very good. So the next question is for Ben. Ben, you wrote with Sharon and some other folks a wonderful issue brief on the need to empower workers in the COVID-19 response. Following up on Julie's comments, I think it's fair to say that in many workplaces in the United States, workers are excluded from significant voice and influence over all sorts of decisions at work in meat packing plants, distribution warehouses, hospitals, and health facilities. Many workers are just simply not very empowered to make many decisions at all. What are some of the problems that you're seeing that they face now because they lack power, and that some of your proposals to rebalance the ability, the allocation of decision-making authority would achieve? Like, what are some of the problems that you're seeing across the economy?
Yeah, so the problems are sort of obvious and predictable. If you exclude workers from the way that their work life is organized and structured, their interests are going to be largely ignored. And we've seen that for decades now in the United States. What the pandemic has done is it's made the consequences immediate and life and death. And immediately life and death for far too many people. So that's true for the millions of workers today who are at work providing essential services, but it's going to be true for all of us as we go back to work during this reopening process. And you know, for Sharon and for me and for many of us who study labor unions and labor law, the solution to this problem is really worker voice and worker power. And I see sort of three reasons why worker voice, worker power is so important in the pandemic and in the reopening, some of which Julie touched on in her own comments. So the first is what we can think of as a moral reason. People ought to have a right as a matter of basic fairness, as a matter of basic dignity, to participate in the construction of their lives. And that's true for political democracy, and it's true at work also. And again, this is not new, but it's just made so profoundly acute by the pandemic. The idea that you could be a nurse, that you could be required to go to work in an emergency room and not even have a voice in the safety provisions that you're provided is an outrage and is morally unacceptable. But beyond this argument, there are two others. The first is a kind of information expertise argument. Nobody knows better than a frontline worker what the safety and health risks they face are, and nobody knows better than frontline workers how to address them. So if you want to know what's dangerous about being a FedEx driver, about being an Amazon delivery driver, about being a grocery store worker, you ought to ask the workers. And if you want to know how to make it safer, you ought to ask the workers. And by not giving the workers power and protection to have a voice in these matters, we lose what Julie's describing and sort of the benefits of workplace democracy. And I'll just add, in case it's not obvious, this is not esoteric or abstract. If grocery stores aren't safe, we don't have food supply. And if our food workers aren't safe, we don't have a safe food supply. If our nurses aren't safe, we don't have healthcare. So these are issues that are longstanding but made so acute by the pandemic. The last thing I'll say, the last reason we need to focus on worker voice and power is a kind of enforcement, or just the ability to bring home what we need. So if you want to make sure that workplaces are safe and healthy, the way to do it is make sure that workers have the power to demand that workplaces are safe and healthy. It's a very simple proposition. Workers care about their own safety and health. If you empower them to demand safe and healthy workplaces, you will get them. And so these are the consequences of a lack of worker voice and power are obvious in the pandemic, very acutely so. And the reasons to move in the direction of worker voice and power, this moral demand, the expertise and sort of information proposition, and the raw power component of this, again, just to emphasize, if workers have the power to demand safe and healthy workplaces, we'll get safe and healthy workplaces. We're not going to get that from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. We're not going to get that from government, probably ever, and certainly not in the current moment.
Thank you very much, Ben. So we're kind of drilling down now from moral reasons and very large scale considerations of the kind that Julie laid out. And Ben, you're getting a little bit more specific with details about the information and what workers could do, both from the power perspective and from the knowledge perspective, if they had a little more voice at work. I suspect for a lot of folks who are listening, like in these Ash Center events, we focus a lot on political democracy, and people know what that looks like because they show up every Tuesday, every few years in November to fill out a ballot, and we're, appropriately worried about what that's going to look like in November. And we've had a lot of discussion about that. But this idea of workplace democracy, I suspect people don't really have a clear picture of what that is, because we just simply, in the United States and in many other countries, don't have so much direct experience of participating democratically at work. So, Sharon, in your white paper, you lay out a couple of different levels of worker democracy and worker empowerment. There's the workplace level, and then an even stranger word, the sectoral level. And can you spend a few minutes fleshing out for people, since it's not the same as filling out a ballot and putting it in a machine in your polling place in a school basement or church basement or whatever, can you spend a few minutes sketching out what workplace democracy would really look like and worker power would really look like?
Sure. And I think it looks a little bit different in each of those levels. So if we start with the sectoral level, what it looks like is a representative democracy, right? You can't obviously have all of the workers in a sector directly participating in
give people some examples of what is a sector? Like, how do you think about a sector?
So a sector could be fast food. And this is an alien, like you said, an alien concept for many Americans, but this is in fact the way that collective bargaining is done in much of the world. Sometimes you hear it referred to as like a European system, but it's actually not. It's prevalent in South America. It's the way that collective bargaining is done in South Africa. It is sort of the dominant model. And the idea is that you have worker representatives in many countries, most countries that are sort of the dominant unions within the sector, sit down at a bargaining table with the large employers, with representatives, sort of like, think about like chambers of commerce within the sector. Sometimes also the government is involved. You can have what you call tripartite systems. And at those sectoral tables, what you do is set like the big overarching principles for the economics. And in this context, really importantly, in what we proposed in our paper, the safety and health matters for that sector. And you can see why that would make sense, right? Grocery stores, say, have certain common features across that sector. And there are a couple of important reasons to do this at the sectoral level. One is that there is sort of an efficiency or an economy of bringing in that expertise, looking across the whole sector, seeing what the sort of technical knowledge is of how the sector works. And so what would be the most effective, if we're thinking about safety and health, what would be the most effective measures? But even probably more importantly, is that when you deal with these issues at a sectoral level, you take the cost of them out of competition. And that's critically important in this context, I think, because we shouldn't be competing on a company's willingness to cut corners on their workers' safety. So if you set these safety and health measures as a standard across the sector, now the playing field is level. And so hopefully that keeps it at a higher level. Then, though, you come down to democracy in the workplace, which is also really important. That is obviously where workers live. They don't really live in the sector, they live in the workplace. And so that's a more traditional, it's still representative democracy, but in a much closer matter. It's sort of the difference between how you may feel about your United States senator versus your city council person. And even when you're setting these standards at the sectoral level, there are a lot of decisions that need to be made specific to a particular workplace. So, for example, the decision at the sectoral level for the grocery sector might be, you have to have somebody who stands at the entrance to the store and make sure that every customer is wearing a mask in order to protect the workers. Well, you go to the workplace and you say, well, who's going to do that job? Is it a full-time job? Is it something that cashiers rotate in and out of? It's sort of that more on-the-ground adaptation. And it's also important to have that strong workplace representation, sort of what Ben was saying, as sort of the enforcement mechanism too. Who can workers go to make sure that these standards are being followed, that when there's a problem, it's quickly remediated. So you have the two places, and hopefully you've got a good dialogue between both the sectoral bargaining and the workplace bargaining, so that it starts to create a system that really works, and where workers have both that big voice to sort of set standards that are impact sort of the economy in a larger sense, but then also have some sense of control over their own workplace.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sharon. It's probably useful for people to think about, like, in your own, if you are fortunate enough to be employed in this moment in your own workplace, what would that look like? What are the kinds of decisions that are being made that would affect your health and safety, or those of your customers, if you have them, or students, if you work in the university context? I think some of us in university, it varies a lot from university to university, are fortunate because at least there's a little bit of a tradition of some kind of participation in these decisions. So I think one thing that all Ben and Julie and I and Isabelle will be facing in the next semester as we reopen is, well, are there special arrangements that should be made for our colleagues who are older than 50 or 60, of which there are many? And if some of us who are below that threshold have to take up a little bit more of the slack of the teaching, I'd be happy to do that. But that's a kind of workplace decision that affects health and safety of the colleagues and potentially of the students and other. And so that's, an example from my world in the university world, but in a grocery store, in an office setting, there's all kinds of decisions that are being made. And so, think about what those are and what it might look like for employees to have a little bit more voice and influence. And that can happen in all kinds of ways, just to kind of make this question of workplace democracy a little more tangible for people, since we have not so much experience, less experience than political democracy. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the question of how to get from here to there, these power questions. And this one goes to Isabelle. So toward the end of the open letter, the manifesto that you guys have written, you're clear that workplace democracy won't happen by itself. You write that, quote, left to their own devices, most capital investors will not care for the dignity of labor, and that, quote, we should not react now with the same innocence as in 2008. So, how should we act now? What do you see as the opportunities to advance the forms of worker empowerment that you call for? Isabelle, over to you.
Thank you, Arkan. Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. Yes, the question of why now? Why is it now more possible than ever to put these questions on the table is indeed a very important question to be sort of clear about what's the answer. And I guess we in academia who witnessed the crisis of 2008, we could only see that crisis as a missed opportunity, I would say, to really rethink the structure of the economy so it can help us meet our democratic commitment and the need to respect planetary boundaries. And when you think about it, as the state was at the time in 2008, but is doing today, all the states around the globe injecting enormous amount of money, even the European Union, which is famously known for being austerity, committed. It means that really here, these are public political questions that really needs to be carefully considered. So why this moment should or could and can be different, I guess. A first piece here is that because workers' motivation is going to be key in the recovery of our economies. It's very clear, based on all that was shared so far, that the crisis to be addressed really rely on this labor investment, and that workers, because they are so essential, are needed at the job, at the checkout, and to make that happen, we really need to rely on workers' motivation. And actually, people care to be treated fairly. That makes a huge difference. And as Julie said about her research, we have tons of evidence that when workers are treated in a way that they really are involved in the decisions that they have to apply, they are much more efficient, they are much more committed, obviously. So that actually should not come as a surprise, but it seems that it's still very important to make that clear. But this was also not something, the crisis reveals these facts, actually. It's not new. And you might remember, because the focus on the essential worker is very interesting, because it's really now highlighting the role of low-skilled jobs, mostly, or at least a section of those jobs. But for high-end jobs, let's think about the example that took place. So 2 summers ago at Google, the Maiden project that was really fought against by the Google engineers themselves. They fought against that project because they realized that Google was actually providing the means to the Pentagon to be able to wage the war without human decision. This drone program that they realized they were preparing. And so the engineers inside Google voiced their view about, what's the finality of Google actually? What should be Google about? And they said in their open letter, Google is not in the business of war, or should not be. And so that's very telling about how, from the low skilled jobs to the high skilled jobs, in a service-based economy, in the context of a democratic society, it's absolutely nonsensical not to care for what your workers think as an employer. So I guess it's really now it's more the moment than ever, but also from the other segment that we have. So in the op-ed, we have three principles that are highlighted, right? The democratizing the firm, as Julie explained, but also decommodifying labor, as she said. And why is it now also more necessary than ever? But because the economic crisis is going to be as bad as the crisis of 1930s. So it's worse than we could think. So a job guarantee program is more relevant now than ever. And as Pavlina Cherneva, who is in our group of scholars who signed this op-ed, says unemployment is a policy choice. And so we have a choice, and societies have a choice to choose a better future. And actually today the ILO issued a new report calling for employment guarantee around the world. So this to connect exactly to your question, to connect the dots. But then a third level also I want to address is the biggest crisis that is looming. Actually, it's not the COVID-19 crisis, it's the climate crisis. And so we should absolutely take like this crisis as a terrible opportunity to get our economy and our society in proper shape so that we can face the next crisis, which is this climate change crisis. And when you know that 73% of the global energy consumption could be saved, according to the engineers at the University of Cambridge, through achievable design changes, which means changes in our production process, which are achievable. We don't need new technology to enact these changes. And they could bring us to this savings of 73%. But what is needed for these changes to happen is labor, more labor force. And so in the world of cheap energy prices, of course, if you don't change the structure, the decision structure of our economy, these changes will never happen. And I would like to add one final point about the interconnection between what Sharon and Ben said and Julie, is that I think it seems to be a moment of reckoning in this crisis, that the two institutions that impact most workers, that is the labor market and the firm, are those two institutions that really need to be carefully reconceptualized and redressed if we want to be able indeed to sustain a society that is both democratic and sustainable from an environmental standpoint.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to explore a little bit the opportunities and the challenges for moving in this direction at different scales, at the micro scale and at the larger scale that all of you are thinking. And there's a really quite a moving question on the chat from Tyra Walker. And Tyra writes in the chat, I recently published an op-ed discussing the unique vulnerabilities of New York's psychiatric facilities, spotlighting my mom's experience as a frontline nurse at a state-run psychiatric hospital. Before publishing this piece, I reached out to my mom's employer directly, emailed the chief executive nursing officer of the New York Office of Mental Health, reached out to former HLS classmate who works for Cuomo's COVID-19 task force. Unfortunately, none of these strategies seem to move the needle in terms of influencing policy to protect frontline workers like my mom. What do you all suggest is the best mobilization strategy for shining a light on the hazardous conditions that workers continue to face, even as the pandemic continues to wane? Particularly, what is the best way to incentivize state and local governments to actually be responsive? So we have this moment in which we feel an enormous amount of solidarity and gratitude to all of these frontline workers, like Tyra's mom, and yet a simple effort to try to make their workplace situation a little bit better in New York, of all places, which is supposed to be a model of response, kind of comes up against a brick wall for Tyra, at least. Maybe other people have had more success, but this is Tyra's story. So what can be done? This is a micro level question about some changing workplace conditions in some way, shape, or form. Like, what are the opportunities? What are the obstacles? Anybody, any thoughts on that? Isabelle.
Just to jump on that question, I think what we are actually doing right now is exactly what we should do. That is, we have, we as scientists, we can highlight, illuminate, try to make sense of what's going on in society. And we have tools to make that, visible, to make the invisible visible, which is an important, obviously, responsibility vis-a-vis those essential workers, whom we did not look at earlier. But that role that scientists have to shed light on phenomenon that should be actually discussed is, I think, really the biggest role we can have. And Clean Slate, as our op-ed, I think highlight the needs that society is willing to get that type of input. And just to finish on that, we were really astonished. Julie is a specialist Julie is an expert on studying social change, so I will let her comment on that. But it was just astonishing to realize that in 2 weeks, we circulated that piece in 2 weeks, and we got more than 3,000 colleagues in the span of 2 weeks, and engaging with translation and reaching out to their national media. It's just very telling about the need for us as scientists, I think, to be vocal about these issues, and I think that's really the way we can make a difference.
If I could just build on that also, so first to acknowledge, the work that Tyra's mom is doing, and healthcare providers of all kinds all across the country are doing under such demanding and really unfair and unacceptable conditions. And also to applaud Tyra's own work to expose these conditions. My view a little more generally is what we need is mobilization and law reform happening at the same time. And we've seen some mobilization by workers across the country who are just fed up, both with the safety and health conditions in which they're being forced to work, and the lack of any channel for demanding change. And what happens is people start getting fed up and taking to the streets. And that puts pressure on lawmakers to make the law better. And even in places like New York, we need that kind of mobilization to pressure legal and policy change. Now, what would that legal and policy change look like? Well, Sharon and I are coming up with some proposals that might help. And what we think is that we need like a three-pronged approach to fixing the problems at a place like the hospital where Tyra's mom works. So immediately, every workplace should have what we're calling a safety steward. And the safety steward should be elected by the workers and should be the point person for safety and health problems. That they would identify safety and health problems, bring them to the attention of the employer and to the public, and start to move the ball forward. Then we need a safety and health committee, again, elected by the workers at the level of the workplace, that would be charged with developing safety and health protocols and making sure that they get enforced. And then at the level of the sector, we want sectoral level safety and health commissions. So if we had a healthcare sector or a mental health sector, I'm not sure what it would be, to develop protocols that would be enforceable across the country for workers who work in hospitals. So that's a lot, but it requires both on the ground mobilization to create political pressure that then gets channeled into policy change, which then empowers workers to demand for themselves the kind of conditions that they deserve.
Right. And just to highlight that point, right? I mean, Ben's saying you need political will and movement and pressure, but you also need some legislative and policy solutions ready to go when the window opens. Julie, over to you.
I'm just going to echo what Isabelle and Ben just said here. I think so. What Tara is describing, and thank you so much, Sarah, for your initiative and for this question, is also the reality of how deeply ingrained our system is. Because I believe that Ben just highlighted for us the changes we need to see happen. But then when we try to implement these changes in organizations, we face resistance. And so the question is how to overcome this resistance from a political standpoint. And what I do see in my work is that, as Ben said, we need a movement. We need to change the culture, and we need to change the law. And that's going to take for all of us to participate in that movement, and we need to agitate, to innovate, and to orchestrate. And I think that, to be fair, what we've been doing a lot of is agitation. That's what we did in 2008. A lot of us did, and agitation was needed, and it was highly effective. Occupy was out there, but then it slowly died because there was no innovation, no alternative. And I think what's really powerful today, and where I hope that we academics can modestly contribute, is that we spent the past decades, and especially the past one, studying alternatives. And here we are today with, for example, Ben outlining this is what could happen and this is what could be done. So we have the innovations. And I think that we can contribute. I think we have data showing that some of these things work. And in fact, it could be to the benefit of all. And those could be real win-wins. And then beyond the innovation, we'll need to orchestrate. So we're not yet there because we'll have to do that at the national level as well as within organizations. That will take time. But I think it's more important than ever that we become aware of these political dynamics and we get in there as a movement, as a collective, to make it happen. So I feel that the critical dimension for Tara is now connecting with others like her and thinking about, okay, am I agitating, innovating, orchestrating? How can I contribute to that movement? I think that what she's doing is what we should all be doing as citizens.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, Sharon, go ahead.
I think there's a very interesting moment now of there being the possibility of new coalitions to move towards these political goals. And there's been a lot of time during the Obama administration, thinking about how do you create alliances between consumers and workers, which sounds funny because workers are consumers and consumers are workers, but often we think politically, people think differently about those roles. But I think the terrible public health implications of this virus have made consumers and workers see their interests as much more aligned, right? Keeping the grocery store safe for workers is also keeping it safe for the consumers who walk into that store. And so I hope, I think it's a little early to know, but I hope that there's a potential for broader alliances that can exercise leverage power in a different way on the political system than maybe we've had in the past.
Good. So I want to take off from that point, the potential, either the political potential, the agitation and movement potential, or the policy potential, or the reality of workplace practices, and ask whether you guys are seeing any bright spots yet. The COVID crisis is, it's only been here for a few weeks, 2 or 3 months, depending on where the here is. It's rocked all of our lives. Are you seeing movement toward some of the futures that you're hoping for and that you've written about, either politically on the ground? Do you see people building power, these alliances or other forms, or just the agitation that Ben was talking about, right? And are there initial bright spots there in the United States or other places around the world that Julie and Isabelle are attentive to? And then, more challenging, do you see employers or workplaces moving toward greater worker empowerment in this moment, or policies forcing them to? This is a bright spots question, and the bright spots could come from the street, it could come from the workplace, it could come from the policy arena. Do you see any yet? And if not, where are you hoping to see it?
I'm happy to start. I think, we are seeing more, and this had started even before the pandemic. We've seen more work stoppages. strikes or, walkouts in the past couple of years than we had seen in, decades. And so I think, in part that's born of what Ben was saying, like desperation, which is not a good thing, but to see that desperation translate into workers actually standing together, I think, is, like we were just saying, a really important first step. And I think during this, at least these initial phases of the pandemic, we're seeing it among some workers who are otherwise invisible. Like, I mean, I'm embarrassed to say almost all of us maybe get Amazon packages delivered to our house. We don't think about the people who are working in those warehouses who have to, put those packages together. And yet what has been happening in the terrible conditions for Amazon warehouse workers, I think, has been more attention paid to those conditions during this pandemic than there had been before. And those conditions have been terrible for a while.
Thanks. Good. Anybody else kind of see positive developments on the horizon? Isabelle?
Well, positive. I guess I'm going to be very cautious, obviously, in the assessment, but it's because, as you said, Arkan, we are only at the beginning of this crisis, and I think we are going to go really deeper into the problems before something really serious and positive can happen at a massive level, I would say. But certainly for us researchers who've been working on the alternative arrangements to organize, work employment relationships, they are interesting and bright spots. And for instance, let me take my own close environment in Belgium. The list of essential workers, for instance, was actually the result of what we referred earlier as sectoral bargaining at the national level. That is, so unions and business associations were involved by the state to decide on that list. And so the involvement of what is called in Europe social partners, that is trade unions and employers association, has been in some country very important. And that certainly has made the situation much more fluent, easy. There was a strong buy-in of the workforce due to the way these decisions were taken. So, and it's certain, if I can add a point on the reception of the op-ed, it's we are a bit overwhelmed, Julie and I and all those involved, with the reception of the op-ed, because so many people want to talk about these ideas, and MPs at the in the European Parliament, media, the radio show in Canada, some like the Vice President of the EU Commission, obviously the Secretary General of the Trade Union, the European Trade Union Confederation, is going to meet with us on June 10th, which means that there is really something happening, I guess, which is then it's too soon to comment on that, but there are certainly new things going on that were not in the air a few weeks ago.
Yeah, very good. And maybe I could ask Julie to elaborate on that point. And one wonderful thing about the letter, the manifesto that you guys published, that it appeared in so many countries at the same moment. So I want to, on the responsiveness and the reception question, maybe that gives you some insight into which societies, which countries are more receptive, more energetic about this new possibility and call, and which ones are maybe a little bit more resistant, the laggards in the workplace democracy story. So how does it look comparatively speaking?
So you're right to say it's been published in more than 40 different newspapers. So the first thing is that it's kind of appeared on all 5 continents. So there's a similarity, which is if you look across the world, there are people who are passionate enough and care enough that they wanted to agitate and contribute to the innovation with all of us, and they joined the movement. We do see differences. I think we have to be very careful as we think about where these differences come from, because what happened is that as a number of people got excited about what was happening over a period of a couple of weeks, we had communication specialists among the academics and others who joined us doing pro bono work, and these people were based in Europe. So I say that because this is a critical factor potentially biasing everything. As a result of that, certainly I would say that the debate in Europe has been stronger than in a number of other places. And as Isabelle mentioned, the EU and a number of the EU officials have been in touch with us, and there's movement not only at the grassroots level there, but potentially also coming from the public authorities, unions. Now, again, I'm very careful because if we compare to the United States, let's say, yes, you could say less reaction. We have to be thinking about the differences in terms of the institutions and the societal system. So we could be thinking, well, if we talk about workplace democracies and these changes, it would be legitimate to potentially make an assumption that in countries where you have a stronger welfare state and a tradition of engagement of workers like co-determination in Germany, you would expect to see more of a debate now than you would in the US. But again, take that with a grain of salt, because in the US, we were not really as active trying to relay the message in the media. We didn't have the same access as we did in Europe. The one thing I want to mention that to me is really striking is that there is one category of population across the world that has been excited and that's reaching out to us. It's the younger generation, our students and beyond. Like these younger people, I keep getting emails from them. They want to hear more. They are interested. They're part of the movement. And they really come from across the world. And they're united in this desire to create this new societal model. And they find some of the debates to be completely irrelevant because they're so clear about the urgency to reform the system. And so I have a lot of faith in them across the world. And I think that these young people are remarkably similar again in their desire to change and be a positive force.
Thank you very much. I think there's been several different questions asking about the inequalities that are maybe a problem for workplace democracy. So, even in the comparative gloss that Julie just gave, right? If you're a German auto worker in Baden-Württemberg, you're probably, or Bavaria, you're probably have a little bit more access and possibility of creating worker power than you are if you're in a meat packing plant in Idaho or South Dakota. And so there's worries about whether the call for workplace democracy and the availability of workplace democracy will itself have a bunch of inequality associated with it. So one question from Doris Sari is, what about garment industry supply chains? And you get back down into the supply chain and all of these orders have been cut anyway, but is there any possibility for worker empowerment in the global supply chain? And then Asha Banerjee asks, what about how can labor market policy and proposals for workplace democracy take into account racial disparities and the disproportionate impact on workers of color, as the COVID crisis has already had? So how do you think about all of these inequalities, even within the labor market, as a lens for thinking about workplace democracy? Is workplace democracy for workers who are already quite advantaged?
This is just an incredibly important question, and deserves sort of primacy in the debate. Just to take U.S. labor law, U.S. labor law has had racial exclusions baked in from its inception through explicit exclusions for domestic workers and agricultural workers, which were written into the law by essentially white Southern senators as a condition of passage. And so when we wrote our Clean Slate report, we started with this idea of inclusion, and the idea being the first thing that labor law reform has to do. The first thing we need to do when we think about worker power or workplace democracy is to address the inequities that have been part of our system since its very beginning. And, you know, again, with the pandemic, there's nothing new here. It's just so much more acute, immediate, and salient. The fact that workers of color are suffering the most and disproportionately is obvious and has to be addressed. And so what I would say is, if it is true that workplace democracy has been too limited in general, and it has been especially limited with respect to low-wage workers of color and women, and when we go forward with reform, we have to make that front and center in our reform efforts. On global supply chains and supply chains generally, again, a dynamic that disproportionately affects workers of color. The approach of sectoral bargaining does a lot to address that problem. Sectoral bargaining does a lot to address all the machinations that employers engage in to exclude workers from coverage, whether it's supply chains, franchises, misclassifying workers as independent contractors. The beauty of sectoral bargaining is if you're in the sector, you're covered, full stop. And so there is some reason to be hopeful about that approach.
Good. Isabelle, you were signaling to jump in.
Yes,
go ahead.
Thank you. Just to second what Ben said, I think it's very important in this matter to really keep the eyes on these two institutions, the firm and the labor market, at the same time. And these pieces should move forward together, because obviously sectoral bargaining is absolutely key if we don't want that workplace democracy become some kind of a cherry on the pie for the wealthiest already workers in an economy. That is absolutely key, to think about the two institutions moving toward being, you know, part of the democratic project.
Very good. So we're about out of time, but I thought we might have just a quick lightning round about what do you think is the most important thing to be done by anyone or any type of action to move this goal that all four of you have front and center in your minds of empowering workers in the economy, at work, at whatever level. What is for you, the most important thing to be done on the top of that list to move that agenda forward a little bit, like right now, like tomorrow? Anybody?
All right, I'll go. You know, I think there is, you know, my real answer would be labor law reform, but I think you're looking for something a little bit more.
No, that's good. No, good.
And in a moment where so much federal money is moving out, that's taxpayer money, I think the narrative and the imperative to put conditions on that money that start to solve these problems is just extremely important, and we haven't done enough of it yet.
Yeah, that's really good. Isabelle and Julie wrote about that at the end, is the conditionality on all of this public taxpayer, unbelievable amounts that are going out the door. Anybody else have any thoughts on the agenda for action?
I'm going to agree with Sharon on that, because what's at stake is really redistributing power. It's a political issue. It's not a matter of creating new trainings and making sure we just understand each other. It is a political issue. It's about control over valued resources. And we need to transfer some of that power so that it's more equally distributed. So I agree, it's going to be run to the low. And I think we have a chance now to condition the help that should come to also these real changes within organizations. And we now have the innovations. We know what to do. So I think it's a time when we have to be vigilant and push for that. Great,
very good. Isabelle or Ben, any last words on that question, or any last words at all?
You know, it was just like we were saying before, we need a movement that includes people mobilizing for political pressure, and policy folks and academics working on the policies that are needed once the political moment is available. And this is in part an answer to the bright spot question. I do think we're doing a better job in preparing ourselves for the possibility that there will be a political opening for real fundamental change. And if that moment comes, I think we'll be ready.
Great, thank you very much. Isabelle, any last words?
Onward.
Thank you very much. This has just been an incredible discussion. I feel so grateful to you and for the opportunity to have this discussion with everybody out there on YouTube. I think that this is not the typical discussion of democracy or the medical or public health issues around COVID-19, but this may be the most fundamental question, and you guys have offered a lot to think about and an incredibly ambitious set of ideas tied all the way down to a very, very concrete reality that makes it immediate for all of us. So thank you very much. And for those of folks who are interested in the next bits, the next discussions in this Democracy and Justice in the Pandemic series, please join us on June 10th. We'll be having a discussion on creating a 1 million-person public health corps akin to the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration efforts in the New Deal to relieve unemployment and to really elevate the level of human care, as well as fighting COVID-19 in the United States. Thank you very much. And thank you to Ben and Julie and Isabelle and Sharon. A huge hand and great gratitude to you guys. Everybody have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arkan.
Hey, are we?